Is this still being pursued by the defense?
Judge, the only thing that I thought about going into was that he didn't leave Pierce County on terms that he wanted to.
How do we know that?
Well, because he said so in his interview. I asked him about it.
All right. What's that got to do with anything?
Well, I mean, I think it's important in the fact that he's, at the time of this event, right? So, at least in terms of timing, he signs this autopsy report on May 19th, 2020. On that date, he's actually no longer the medical examiner for Pierce County. The new medical examiner started on the 18th. And so, at the very least, I wanted to address that. And then I had an additional couple of questions about the fact that at that point in time, he had actually left Pierce County, and it wasn't by really his own choice.
What's the relevance of that? Does it go to bias?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was unhappy with what was going on in Pierce County and the allegations against him.
Sure. You think that has anything to do with the autopsy report he signed?
I think it may.
What else you got?
I mean, other than the fact that Dr. Mitchell testified that he felt that there were things that could have been done in this autopsy, like the dissection of the brain could have showed us that there was hypoxia, if there was hypoxia. I think he said that there could have been additional photos that were taken, both internal as well as external.
No, I think he talked about tissue samples in the back muscles too, but I don't know what's...
I mean, I think that's in line with one of the allegations that was made in high information that Dr. Clark doesn't, he only does only takes photos and gathers evidence that's going to try and support his file.
Well,
so, Judge, I can leave it alone. If you, I see where the court's heading with this. I can leave it alone if the court's more comfortable with that. It wasn't a huge portion.
I'm on my comfort level. It's just a matter of what's the ruling that's proper,
Right,
you know?
you're right.
And so I don't see there's much to this.
Okay. Understood.
Ms. Bircher, you have... All right, so you were all at this point are in agreement with granting that motion? Is that what I'm hearing? All right, so your motion's granted.
Yes, Judge. With respect to the proposed exhibit 569, which was provided this morning, I'm not sure what the intention is for purposes of this exhibit. I understand the timeline. I'm not entirely certain where all the information came from.
I don't know what the exhibit is.
Okay. It's been provided before. 569. Yeah, there's two exhibits, 568 and 569.
I can hand my copy forward to the court have it. Oh, I think it's right there.
Just put it out of Mrs. Winnie's reach, so.
Sorry.
I'm not worried about 568.
Oh, I see. It says- They're at the door. Kayla has them.
Okay, so 569 is a kind of timeline here. It's got some handwritten marks on it too.
I guess my first question is just how is it seeking to be introduced to Dr. Clark?
I don't know.
Happy to elaborate. This comes out of the information that Dr. Clark had in his file line. I believe it's exhibit 265, if I remember correctly. All of the medical examiner information, 270 maybe, it's either 265 or 270. And this only relates, this was provided to Dr. Clark by law enforcement. He asked for a timeline of events when he was trying to, before he authored his original autopsy report, just to understand the sequence of events. And this was the information that he was provided.
Does this vary in any significant way to the timeline that's been established otherwise in this case?
Yes.
I didn't look at it for the specific times, I was looking at it for the information he was given, and that's what was important to him, because he based his initial conclusion in part on the information that he was given from the pre-hospital report as well as from this timeline.
Right, but it is different, right?
Which part do you say is different?
Well, the entry of 23, 24, 38, the second to the last on the first page, references three separate events, 3 or 4 separate events. One of which he says the spit sock occurred at 23, 24, and 38, but that's not true. The spit sock did not occur until 3 minutes later. It was placed on Mr. Ellis by Officer Green's.
Judge, it also includes statements that you excluded within Exhibit 18, the illustrative.
About what?
I can't breathe.
Well, some of that was allowed. I'm not sure if this particular reference was.
And Judge, there's other times that are off by, 10 to 15 seconds as well. To 10 seconds, sorry.
Well, it seems to me at least a couple things occurs to me about this. One is, if this is the information that Dr. Clark was making his decision on, that we may be entitled to be considered to the extent that it had an impact on his thoughts. And of course, to the extent that this timeline is not accurate, then that would potentially affect his opinions as well. I don't know about how we want to display this, or I don't think it would be something we'd want to, well, we may need to display it, but we may need to have some kind of, what's the word, an advisory, if you will, that maybe these numbers are not correct. I don't know. Maybe these numbers are correct, the ones we've got are wrong. How do I know?
I'm sorry?
Maybe these numbers are right and the ones that we've got are wrong.
It could be, I don't think so, but they could be.
Well, Your Honor, all I can say is that this is what he relied on. So when he's making determinations
Right.
of the underlying facts, this is what law enforcement gave him. So that's what he relied on, whether it's
Sure.
right, wrong, or I think that with respect to the spit,
I don't want to give the jury misleading information, I guess is what I'm saying. But now, if the doctor was misled to some extent, I mean, that's not his fault, obviously, if he's given bad information and he's entitled to, make his decisions based on the information he's got. That's all any of us can do.
correct.
So I've got no problem with it from that perspective. But as I say, there might be some kind of, I don't know, advisory about the timing, the accuracy of the timing, whether this is right, wrong, or indifferent. I don't know I don't know where this came from. Do we know who gave it to him?
Lieutenant Rockland,
Okay.
detective or lieutenant, I believe is what the notes indicate. That's who he received it from.
Ms. Bircher, so what's your question then?
Well, I just was curious how it's going to be used. I think I understand it now.
Okay.
I don't know that it should be admitted as substantive evidence.
Was there another exhibit you had an issue with? This is the only thing you had an issue with?
Pardon?
This is the only issue you had?
That's the only issues I had was with respect.
And now you understand you no longer have an issue?
Well, I have an issue with admitted. I mean, if he wants to reference it, that's fine. It should not be admitted as substantive evidence.
Well, I think that's probably right.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
I think that's probably right, given that we have the differences, I suppose. Admitted as, I don't know if you heard this, he doesn't want to admit it as substantive evidence.
Yes, well, we were gonna offer it as substantive, but we can offer it as illustrative and not go back to the jury.
Yeah, the substantive thing, I think, is problematic, given that we're pretty sure that some of these numbers are wrong. So then it would just confuse the matters. If we know if there was some genuine dispute about them, I suppose then maybe it could come in. The jury then would have to make a decision, but we kind of know that some of this is wrong. Mr. Conrad.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't have any objection to him referencing it to refresh his recollection about stuff, but I don't think
This, I take it this timeline was recreated from notes or something? I mean, was this, I mean, it was, the document that went to Dr. Clark was not literally this document.
It was literally this document.
Okay. Well, how about the hand,
Asked for a timeline,
How-
and this is the document that Brockway gave him.
how about the handwritten document, handwritten comment about hobs and cuffs removed?
That's my understanding is that that's Dr. Clark's handwriting, based on conversations with the, I believe with Lieutenant, Brockway.
No, go ahead, Mr. Osler.
I think I maybe can help you a little bit. So this is part of a PowerPoint presentation that the reviewing department prepares in anticipation for presentation to the prosecuting attorney's office for a charging decision. And so what Brockway would have done is created this, consulted with Clark, they would get together and present to the prosecuting attorney's office using this information to describe for them what the circumstances are to determine whether charges are filed or not. That's my understanding of where it came from and why Brockway gave it to Dr. Clark. That's not unusual. That's in every use of force case.
Sorry, I didn't interrupt. I don't actually believe that that's accurate, Your Honor. This was information that was given to Dr. Clark long before he actually even made his decision and issued his report. According to his notes, which is Exhibit 269, he said that he met with Detective Brockway, who brought a timeline and report from Tacoma Fire on 3/20. So that's where he got it. He got it along with the pre-hospital report on the 20th. It wasn't prepared for a presentation to the prosecutors. It was prepared because Dr. Clark asked for a timeline to understand the events, and it was prepared in response to that. All the information on it, my understanding, was put together by Brockway, and then it was given to Dr. Clark according to his notes on the 20th of March.
That's exactly the process, Judge. So I was just saying, they create this in conjunction with each other, then they collaborate and present to the prosecutor's office. I'm not contesting that's how this came. That's the process for which it gets to Dr. Clark and the use that it's for.
But it wasn't even, there was no autopsy finding
That's
on
not-
March
that-
20th.
Of course not.
I mean-
That's it.
Well, then why
That's
would
not
it
the
be
process.
presented to the prosecutor if there hadn't been a determination of what the
They
cause of
present it
death
at
was?
I'm not saying they are. They present it at a later date. This is how they collaborate with all the information. He won't author an autopsy report until they get the toxicology back. That's the process. And so he gets all this information in advance with the investigating agency to prepare the presentation.
All right. Anyway. Tempest.
Dr. Clark can testify what he got.
Okay, so anyway, I'm not hearing any particular issue about 569, except one they don't want it introduced for substantive purposes, and I tend to agree with that. And is this going to be, well, does this need to be shown to the witness? I mean, is there something about your questioning of the doctor that requires this timeline?
Yes, I think it does need to be shown to the witness. I don't need to show it to the jury if the court doesn't want me to do that.
Unless it becomes some kind of point of contention that, you know, if there's a suggestion that Dr. Clark got the times wrong because of efforts he made, then it seems to me it's fair for the doctor to be able to reference this. This is the information I was given from law enforcement, and so that it doesn't look like he's somehow sloppy.
That's fine, and the importance of
So
it.
I think that's right, but I don't like the idea of giving them a number that's different from the number in terms of the time frame that we've already established through other means. That would be potentially confusing and/or, and they could certainly take it down as a note if they saw it. So, but if you have to go there, I appreciate it. You may have to go there. So, I guess we'll see.
Usually I'll just ask him about the information that he received, and depending on cross, if I think it needs to be shown to the jury, I'll address it.
I think that sounds great, Ms. Eakes.
Redirect.
Yep, that sounds good. Anything else, Mr. Conner? You're standing again.
Two quick issues. One is, I mentioned this yesterday, I believe, about experts relaying hearsay information to the jurors. And I noted my objection yesterday on confrontation issues, and I was looking at the case law last night.
Well, I'm not sure you noted much of an objection. You kind of broadly waived this idea that if Dr. Clark doesn't testify, for instance, that there's huge confrontation problems, which I said something, I'm not so sure about that. But
Well,
I don't recall that specifically an objection. I think
okay. I guess I should have been more clear. So my objection on confrontation issues would not only be limited to Dr. Clark, but it would also pertain to information from other officers to the extent that they're relaying that information.
You mean like this?
Yeah, but we've heard from Brockway, so I don't think I have much of an issue there. But to the extent that he's relying upon Officer Ferenas or Lieutenant Sanders or Massanio and relaying hearsay information from those statements, I think we should have an opportunity to confront those individuals. So I'd be noting my objection to any information that they're relaying with regards to statements made from those individuals. The other issue that's come up, and I think it happened with the cardiologist, is this idea that they're pointing to prior interviews that Lieutenant Wilson did and trying to, I think, muddy the waters a bit about whether he said there was a pulse or not a pulse. I think that the jury really needs to be instructed that the testimony that they should rely upon is the testimony that comes from the stand and not what Dr. W thinks someone said during an interview or his interpretation of an interview, at some earlier date that wasn't done under oath or, isn't an accurate interpretation in my opinion. So I just
Well,
want to...
the issue with experts, I don't want to get bogged down in this, but the issue with experts is that if the information is the kind of information that would typically be relied upon by experts in the field, informing their opinions, then they ordinarily may do so. And it may otherwise be information that wouldn't be admissible. You can always examine them about the basis of the information being, whether it's reliable or not, and that's a kind of objection that's ordinarily made before the expert testifies. To the extent that that Lieutenant Wilson's information from an interview was used by them in forming an opinion, well, it was, and you can point out where he was wrong or he wasn't, or he misunderstood Lieutenant Wilson, or you may be able to point out, as has been pointed out, which is Lieutenant Wilson made clear, if it wasn't clear to them when they read over the materials, that in fact Mr. Ellis did have a pulse when he encountered Lieutenant Wilson. And to the extent that the doctors offered opinions that were based on the idea that Mr. Ellis did not have a pulse at that point in time, then they were basing their opinion on erroneous information. And I think part of the thing with Lieutenant Wilson is that if you actually look more carefully at what he said, he wasn't inconsistent about it. I can understand why they may have made a mistake about it. But that was talked about, and of course then it was also discussed that even assuming that, their opinions weren't changed. Right? So I'm not sure exactly what you want me to do about an instruction to the jury. If you've got proposed instruction, make it, and we'll go from there. So.
I guess we'll just see how Dr. Clark's testimony comes out, and then to the extent that he's going to relay information that was made during interviews with officers that haven't testified yet, then I would ask for a limiting instruction. And, I think it's appropriate based on the cases that I've seen. So that's all I want to mention.
You can give me the limiting instruction.
Understood.
You can propose it. I may give it.
There's a jury instruction. It's WPI 365.03, basis of expert opinion.
Yeah.
And then there's a case as well, Judge. I can give you the citation. It's a Washington State Supreme Court case. The citation is in re detention of Marshall, and it's 156 Washington 2nd at 150. It's a 2005 case, and it says under one of the head notes, Washington State Evidence Rule 705 grants the court discretion to allow an expert to relate hearsay or otherwise inadmissible evidence to the trier of fact to explain the reasons for his or her expert opinion subject to appropriate limiting instruction. So I guess we'll just see how it plays out, but I just wanted to mention that to the court.
Right, but you're citing the civil instructions.
I
right?
am. It's the only one I could find, Judge.
Yeah, well, I think there is a civil instruction along those lines, but because I'm not in my regular courtroom, I don't have it.
Okay. I have
I have the
can
criminal
hand up my
instructions,
copy.
but not the civil
You want me
ones.
to hand up my copy?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Ms. Brenner, could you hand this to the court?
Well,
There's a lot going on there.
well,
We can see how far it plays out.
yeah, and this instruction would not entirely fit, I'm sure.
I couldn't find anything else. I looked. So, and the last thing I
But what I love, though, about the lawyers is, well, Judge, just give an instruction.
I know.
Where is such an instruction? Well, I couldn't find one, but I'm sure you've got one, Judge.
Well, you've been doing this much longer than me, Judge, so I was hoping for some guidance on there, but I'm sure I'll do my best to try and propose that.
This kind of thing happens in the civil realm sometimes, not often, frankly.
Understood. And Judge, last.
Because we all kind of operate on the basis of what I said before. We understand there's hearsay about this. And there's some kinds of hearsay, even in a medical record, that, for instance,
Understood.
wouldn't be allowed. But anyway, go ahead.
Last thing, Judge, and I promise I'll sit down. So my understanding is the state's calling Mr. Bible just for the limited purposes that we talked about yesterday. I just want to raise the issue that, we have concerns given prior comments from him that, we've been working hard on having a fair trial here, and I want to make sure that that continues to happen and that there's no prejudicial comments that are made during his testimony and that he's informed of the motions in limine.
Well, I don't know Mr. Bible very well. We had a hearing with him earlier, and Mr. Bible's an attorney. My impression was that at the hearing we had, he behaved absolutely professionally. I have no reason to think that if he is asked a question, he won't answer it responsively. And if he starts to wander into something that's unresponsive, just like any other witness, make an objection.
And we're not intending to call Mr. Bible. We're going to call Dr. Clark.
You're not going to call Mr. Bible at all?
Correct.
Okay. All right. So we're ready for the jury then?
We're ready.
Okay, let's have the jury.
We're just going to bring Dr. Clark in this courtroom.
That's fine with me. Welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Okay, the state's next witness.
State calls Dr. Thomas Clark.
Thank you, Doctor. Please come forward to right about here and raise your right hand to be sworn. Solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much, sir. Have a seat right there. Please state your name and please spell your name.
Dr. Thomas Clark, C-L-A-R-K.
Your witness.
Good morning, Dr. Clark. Let's pour yourself some water. Can you tell the jury what kind of a doctor are you?
I'm a forensic pathologist.
And are you currently employed?
I have retired from full-time employment. I do have a consulting business with several clients.
How long have you been retired?
I retired at the end of 2020.
Prior to your retirement, where did you work?
I was the Pierce County Medical Examiner.
How long were you the Pierce County Medical Examiner?
A little over 10 years.
And what does it mean to be the Pierce County Medical Examiner?
By law, in Washington, each county has to have either a medical examiner, coroner, or in some cases of very small counties, a prosecutor, coroner, whose job it is to hear about deaths that might potentially be unnatural, to investigate those deaths, and ultimately to certify those deaths.
And you said you did that for 10 plus years, is that right?
That's right.
Can you please tell the jury about your education background that qualifies you to become a Pierce County Medical Examiner and a forensic pathologist?
I was an undergraduate at Duke University. Following graduation, I went to medical school in Charleston, South Carolina. I then returned to Duke Hospital where I did training in internal medicine and then pathology. I went to the office of the chief medical examiner at the University of North Carolina where I did subspecialty training in forensic pathology. Following that training, I remained on the staff as a faculty member and as a pathologist who worked for the state. I ultimately became an associate professor of pathology at UNC when I took early retirement to take the job here in Pierce County.
And what brought you to Pierce County?
I had seen several job openings on the West Coast. We were ready for a change, and I looked at this one, not really thinking I would take it, but I got to the airport for my interview and stepped out of the airport, and it was one of those northwest days with the dark clouds above and the sun around in a rim, and I'd never seen anything like it. And I thought, well, this is going to be better than I thought. And I liked the county officials when I did my interview, and I decided this might be a good place.
And you said that you were here for 10 years. Can you just give us an idea of how big the office is and whether there were any other medical examiners or investigators or who all you worked with there?
During the time I was there, the office was staffed for 2 medical examiners. There weren't 2 the whole time I was there. There are also a number of support staff. There are several administrative staff, 3 or 4 autopsy technicians, and 8 to 10 medical investigators.
And are you board certified?
I am.
And what are you board certified in?
Forensic pathology.
And when did you become board certified as a forensic pathologist?
It was around 1987. I don't remember the date.
And are you licensed to practice medicine?
I am.
Can you give the jury an idea of, if you know, how many autopsies you've performed in your career?
I don't know. I haven't tracked the total number. It's probably somewhere above 7,000 or 8,000 now, but I don't have an exact number.
Have you testified in court before?
Many times,
Any idea how many times you testified?
more than 100.
And in what role have you testified in court?
I always testify as an expert witness in the field of pathology. I have most often been called by prosecution in criminal cases, but I have been called by the defense as well. In civil cases, it depends on which side hires me.
medical examiner, was it an issue of who hired you, or who would you testify for in Pierce County?
The medical examiner's role is a little bit different from a private pathologist in that the medical examiner has an obligation to remain neutral. The medical examiner is supposed to neutrally investigate deaths, come to an independent and correct conclusion, and should be able to express that conclusion in front of a jury and to either side that asks to meet with him or her. And that's what I've done. As medical examiner, I was most often called by the prosecution, but particularly in Pierce County, it was common to also meet with defense attorneys.
And you said you testified hundreds of times. Is that here in Pierce County?
No, that would be total.
Total. And was that also then in North Carolina?
That would have been in North Carolina.
The jury understands or has heard that you performed the autopsy on Manuel Ellis. Is that right?
That's correct.
Did you prepare any reports related to Mr. Ellis's autopsy?
I did.
How many reports did you prepare?
That depends on how you count them.
Explain.
The office would have prepared one set of reports primarily written by one of the investigators, but not exclusively. Anybody in the office can contribute to notes on a case. I personally wrote the autopsy report. That includes a report from the Washington State Patrol, which includes a report from a private toxicology company with whom they contracted. So that's multiple reports that really could be considered part of my report.
And is that the only report that you authored, the autopsy report?
At that time, yes.
At some later time, did you author another report?
Yes,
And what did you call that report?
a supplemental report.
And I just wanted, before we get into the reports, I want to hand you a couple of documents and see if these are reports that you authored and whether or not these would assist you in your testimony today. I'm going to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 250 and State's Exhibit 551. You can tell us whether or not you recognize those documents.
I do.
What are they?
Please give us a number first.
Exhibit 250 is a copy of the autopsy report that I wrote concerning Manuel Ellis. It is not complete because it doesn't include the toxicology report and it does not include my body diagram. But the pages that are here are accurate.
And what's Exhibit 551?
Exhibit 551 is a copy of a supplemental report that I wrote for the Office of the Attorney General after I retired.
And you said it doesn't contain a toxicology report. Does your report 250 talk about the results of the toxicology report?
Yes,
Okay, so the information is contained in it, but just a separate report isn't attached. Is that correct?
well, not all of the information, but some of the information is.
All right. And would those reports assist you in your testimony today?
Yes.
And can you tell the jury what's the initial date of your report that's Exhibit 250?
I dictated the report on March 4th, 2020. It was transcribed by a typist on that same day. And then I finalized it on May 11th, 2020.
And what is your purpose in preparing the initial report?
An autopsy is done really in stages. The receiving of the body, examining it, dissecting it, is really day one of a process that often takes several months. Following that first examination of the body, I dictated this report in order to preserve my findings, but there were things that weren't finished yet. For example, toxicology, which sometimes takes several months, and histology. Histology is the process of putting small bits of organs, body organs, onto glass microscopic slides so that they can be examined. And that has to happen at a later time because it takes at least a week to get that back. So nothing happens to the report itself for a period of weeks, but then as information starts coming in, I might or might not look at the report again until all of it is in. But when all of the information is in, I would take the report out again, add the microscopic descriptions, and write a conclusion that includes a cause of death. And at that point, I have all the information I need to finish the death certificate if it has not been completed initially.
Right, and you said that you dictated your final conclusions, is that right, on May 11th, 2020?
I am not sure that I dictated my conclusions. I may have typed them myself. I typically would open the report myself when the microscopic slides and talks were back, and I would enter the microscopic descriptions myself and often type the report myself, and that is probably what I did on this one.
Okay, but the date that you finalized your opinions was May 11th, 2020?
That's right.
Okay, I want to ask you about the autopsy. Can you just explain to the jury, you said that there are several things that occurred. You start with the autopsy, but then you get information over the course of time.
Yes.
So can you just explain to the jury generally what the autopsy involves? What do you do?
The autopsy starts with an examination of the outside of the body. During that time, I would make notes and subsequently dictate the general appearance, whether or not clothing was present, whether or not other items were present with the body. After that, the clothing is removed and the body is cleaned if necessary. At that time, I do another exam for injuries, for markings such as tattoos, scars, and do a diagram of any significant injuries that are present. At that time, we also photograph the body, including the back, and detail photographs of any injuries that might be present.
And what's your purpose of doing those photographs?
To preserve the appearance of the body and to preserve the appearance of injuries in case somebody wants to take a look at them later.
And I want to show you a couple of pictures that have already been admitted in this case. And I'd ask the public on 271D and 271E.
Proceed.
Thank you. And that's going to come up on your screen there. Could we start with E, actually? Oh, actually, D is fine. Dr. Clark, is this the photograph from Mr. Ellis's autopsy that would have been taken under your direction?
Yes.
Okay, and what's the purpose of a photograph like this?
The purpose of this photograph is to preserve the number that was assigned to this case by photographing a band that's present on the body and by photographing the placard that's to be used for subsequent photographs.
And if we could take a look at 271E. And is this the photograph that was taken under your direction?
Yes, this is called the identification photograph. This photograph is taken after the body is cleaned. Its purpose is to preserve the identification, the general appearance of the face of the person upon whom an autopsy was performed.
Take that down, thank you. And in addition to those two photographs, were there other photographs taken both as Mr. Ellis initially came in with his clothing or whatever his status was, and then later after the body was cleaned?
Yes.
And is that something that you do in every case?
Yes.
Now, you mentioned that you also looked at some other evidence that came in with Mr. Ellis. What else did you look at?
I'm referring to my report, which is Exhibit 250. He came in with some clothing, athletic short shoes and socks, and there was additional clothing in the body bag with him that had been cut off at the scene, including sweatshirt and sweatpants and a spit hood.
And did you have an opportunity to look at that spit hood on March 4th, 2020?
I did.
All right. And did you make any observations about the spit hood?
I did.
What observations did you make about the spit hood?
I wrote that the spit hood was covered with secretions and or blood, and that it was sticky.
Now, you said that you did start with a physical or exterior examination of Mr. Ellis, is that right?
That's right.
And then you do an interior examination of Mr. Ellis?
Yes.
And what's the purpose of that?
During the internal examination, each of the body cavities is open, and if I might indicate on myself, the head, the chest, the abdomen, so that the organs can be examined. Each of the organs is removed, examined, weighed, photographed if there's any evidence of injury, and that's when the small pieces of these organs are taken for microscopic examination. 2 sets of tissue are taken at that time. One of them goes into small plastic cassettes to be processed and turned into glass microscopic slides. The other set goes into a jar that contains a preservative so that if the initial glass slides don't reveal a cause of death or reveal something that needs further investigation, it's possible to go back to the jar with preservative and submit more sections of all of the organs.
After performing the internal and the external examination of Mr. Ellis, were you able to immediately determine what the anatomic cause of death was?
No, he did not have an anatomic cause of death at the end of that first day.
Can you explain to the jury what an anatomic cause of death is?
Anatomic just refers to anatomy, the body itself. So an anatomic cause of death would be essentially one that I could see, either that day by seeing it with unaided vision or at a later time by seeing it under the microscope.
Can you just give us an example of what would be an anatomic cause of death?
A gunshot wound would be an anatomic cause of death. It's visible to the naked eye. It is easy to describe and photograph and can be fatal, and it can be readily determined that a gunshot wound is fatal.
And how do you determine the cause of death if there isn't an anatomic cause of death that's visible at autopsy?
Well, it's not unusual at that stage. Many people don't have an anatomic cause of death because of the high number of drug overdoses. So it's common not to have an anatomic cause of death, and in those cases the death certificate would be filed with a cause of death of pending and a manner of death of pending. The microscopic slides do sometimes reveal a cause of death that wasn't visible grossly. For example, fatty change of the liver. Sometimes it's visible grossly, sometimes it isn't so obvious. An early heart attack would be visible on glass slides and wouldn't necessarily be visible with the unaided eyes. So those types of things can result in an anatomic cause of death later. But not all cases end up with an anatomic cause of death at all. Some of them have multiple factors that have to be weighed. Some of them are drug overdoses.
So in addition to the examination, physical examination that you did of Mr. Ellis, what other information did you have to assist you in determining the cause and manner of Mr. Ellis's death?
Well, like in most cases, I had an investigation. My office investigators are charged with gathering information. They go to the scene, they take photographs, they talk to law enforcement, they talk to families sometimes, they write reports, they have access to medical records. They can use that information if it's important in a case. I can ask the police to do additional investigation if I think that that is needed. I can do consultations. For example, if I think I have a brain that needs further evaluation, for example, on an infant, I would send the brain to a neuropathology consultant and get a report back from that consultant. There are many possible things that can come in later.
And with respect to Mr. Ellis's death, what other information did you have besides your actual autopsy examination?
I had the scene investigation that my office did. I had access to his medical records. I had a police report.
I'm going to have you take a look at what's been marked and admitted as Exhibit 24 and ask you if you recognize this document.
I do recognize Exhibit 24.
What is it?
It is a pre-hospital care report that came from Tacoma Fire.
And is that a piece of information that you had prior to reaching your conclusions about the cause and manner of Mr. Ellis's death?
I did. I'm not sure if it came in with medical records or if it came in as part of the police report from Southside 911, but I did have it.
You had it before you reached your opinions on May 11th?
Yes, I did.
All right. I'm also going to hand you what's been marked as Exhibit 569 and ask you if you recognize that document.
I do recognize 569.
What is that?
It is a timeline that I asked for when this case was being investigated by law enforcement. I felt like I did not have a good understanding of all of the things that happened and in what order, even after looking over the information that my office obtained during their investigation, and I had to have more information about exactly when things happened insofar as that could be established. And this is a timeline that the investigating agency, the Sheriff's Department, made for me.
Did that provide information that you relied upon in reaching your opinions in this case?
It did.
And you said you also had your investigator information as well as medical records and the toxicology report. Is that correct?
Well, I said access to medical records. I don't know exactly how much I looked at. I don't remember, but I could have.
All right. And what did you conclude on May 11th, in your report of May 11th, 2020, was the cause of Mr. Ellis's death?
I recorded his cause of death as hypoxia due to physical restraint, with other significant conditions of methamphetamine intoxication and dilated cardiomyopathy.
And we'll talk about those things in a minute. What did you conclude was the manner of Mr. Ellis's death?
I concluded his death was a homicide for the purpose of public health coding.
And explain what you mean by that.
The medical examiner is required to put a cause and manner of death on a death certificate. The cause of death is exactly what you think it might be. For example, a gunshot wound, a heart attack. It's a pathologic sequence of events that leads to death. A significant condition is a condition that was present and may have contributed to the death but was not in the direct line of causation. And the manner of death is one of natural, accident, homicide, or suicide, depending on the presence or absence of external forces and the presence or absence of intent. An external force is also exactly what it sounds like, something that arises outside of the body. Examples of external force might be a gunshot wound, a drug overdose, burning, freezing, drowning. Those are all things that require forces that arise outside of the body. If an external force is present, and if that external force significantly contributed to the death, then the death is not natural. It has to be one of accident, homicide, or suicide in that case. And those depend upon intent. Not necessarily intent to kill, but intent to cause the external force that led to or caused the death. For example, a gunshot wound has to be an unnatural death. It has to be one of accident, homicide, or suicide. And it can be any of those, although accidental gunshot wounds, true accidental gunshot wounds are very rare. But you can take the same gun, shoot yourself with it, and it's a suicide. If somebody else shoots you with it, it's a homicide. Because in the case of a suicide, there is intent by an individual to harm or kill oneself. In a homicide, there is an intent by an individual to harm or kill another. And in an accident, there is no intent by a human to kill or harm another. Most motor vehicle crashes get coded as accident.
So it sounds like your options are natural, accident, suicide, or homicide. Is that right?
That's correct.
In terms of what is the manner of death.
And there is one additional option, which is undetermined if there is insufficient evidence to choose one of the other three.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about your conclusion. You said you found that the cause of death in this May 11th conclusion was hypoxia due to physical restraint. Can you explain to the jury what was the basis for that conclusion?
When I finished the various parts of the autopsy and I was ready to write a summary and conclusion, I had three potential causes of death. The autopsy itself showed that Mr. Ellis's heart was too big and that it was dilated. Too big is reference to how much it weighs. Dilated is a reference to how big the chambers are. And his heart weighed 480 grams. That's too much. A heart shouldn't weigh more than about 400 grams. They often do, but there's often a reason for it. The most common reason is hypertension. As I think you've probably learned somewhere along the way, the heart is a muscle. And like other muscles, it can become bigger if it gets exercised. And in the case of the heart, it can get exercised too much. The most common scenario is somebody who's hypertensive for a long time. That heart, every time it contracts, has to push against more resistance than it should. So the muscle gets thicker, and that increases the weight of the heart. That comes at a cost, however, because the bigger a heart gets, the more likely it is to have an accidental dysrhythmia, meaning an electrical conduction that is supposed to go along a specific route, cause the heart to contract and then resolve, goes where it shouldn't, or two of them start at the same time, or any number of other possibilities, and the heart can go into ventricular fibrillation, which is a fatal rhythm. There are other rhythms that it can go into also. So the heart can cause death, even at 480 grams. And it's not uncommon, but like many things in science, this is a bell curve. And would it be okay to use my hands to show the shape of a bell curve? It looks like you might imagine. It looks like a bell. So the average heart weight would be in the middle, and I don't know what it is. I'm just guessing maybe it's 600 grams. And so people to the left of that, 500, 400, could also die, but less commonly. People above that could also die of an increased heart rate, but that's also less common because they usually die before they get to the 800 and 900 gram hearts. So there isn't any magic number at which the heart becomes fatal. People live for years with 600-700 gram hearts, even when they're not taking medicine for it. People die with 480-gram hearts for no apparent reason. It's kind of a crapshoot. Every heartbeat is a miracle. Most of the time it works right, but they don't always work right. And for every gram that the heart is too big, that slightly increases the risk that something is going to go wrong. And I'm explaining all of this just to let you know that there is nothing that I or anybody else can look at with regard to that heart and say it did or did not cause the death, because it doesn't leave any evidence if it does.
Okay. Well, you said you had 3 potential causes of death. You talked about his heart. What were the other 2?
One of them is methamphetamine. And like the heart, methamphetamine is also unpredictable. The amount that Mr. Ellis had is within the fatal range, but it isn't at the top of the fatal range, nor is it at the bottom. It's somewhere in the middle. Like the heart, it isn't possible to look at a number of a methamphetamine concentration and say it did or did not cause the death. It is also not possible to look at methamphetamine in general and say it always causes death when it gets to a certain amount, or it never causes death below a specific amount.
Why is that?
Because it has unpredictable effects. We don't know exactly why it causes death under some circumstances and doesn't under others. But it's unpredictable to the point that an individual could take the same amount of methamphetamine every day for a month, and then on day 31 take the same amount and die from it. It's also possible that 2 individuals could take exactly, or let's even increase it. Let's say we have a whole room full and 100 individuals take the same amount of methamphetamine. 50 of them die. 50 of them don't. And if you did the same experiment, well, it'd be hard to do the same experiment with the ones that are already dead, but if you could, a week later, it might be a different 50 that die. So it really is unpredictable. So now we're up to 2 unpredictable things, methamphetamine and his enlarged heart, which is also called dilated cardiomyopathy.
And so you concluded that he died of hypoxia due to physical restraint. How did you get there when you just talked about the 2 unpredictable factors?
Well, this is going to turn out to be unpredictable factor number 3. There is some anatomic evidence on the body. There was evidence that he was restrained. There was evidence that his face was against the pavement, that his arms were and knees were against the pavement, but nothing that in and of itself should be fatal. However, the history that I was given is that he was restrained with handcuffs, put face down on the street, and then he was hobbled, meaning that his ankles were bound to his wrists with a short strap, and a spit hood was put over his head. And the spit hood has the potential to affect ventilation. It can affect whether you can breathe oxygen in and whether you can dissipate carbon dioxide. So I have yet another set of factors to consider. However, there aren't any studies, there are no papers that you can look at to see exactly what it takes to cause death when somebody's restrained. It's highly variable. It also isn't possible to know exactly what the restraint looked like and exactly how long it lasted. So even if there were papers, we wouldn't be able to apply them. So with 3 variable causes of death, the forensic pathologist has to evaluate each one of them against the circumstances and make a decision that's not just based on science, but also based on experience and judgment about which is the most important. And now there was a little bit of additional information that was helpful. I can refer to State's Exhibit 24, the pre-hospital care report, and it has 2 things in it that are helpful in evaluating the methamphetamine contribution and evaluating the heart contribution. The note from paramedic Wilson states that the pupils were fixed and dilated. The chest was apneic, meaning that the decedent wasn't breathing. And he notes that when they took their first look with an electrocardiogram, the decedent, Mr. Ellis, was in sinus rhythm and deteriorating into PEA, pulseless electrical activity. I'm sure that I will end up going into both of those things, possibly all of those things in more detail, possibly sooner than I think. But
Can you tell us, you said that those were observations that were important to your conclusion that he died from hypoxia. What is the significance of having fixed and dilated pupils to your conclusion that Mr. Ellis died from hypoxia due to physical restraint?
pupillary response is a brainstem reflex. Everybody's familiar with it. When you go out onto a bright, sunny day, your pupils constrict to limit the amount of light that gets into your eye. If you go into a dark room, your pupils expand so that you can get more light. That's something you don't have to think about. It just happens because your brainstem controls it. If your brainstem is dead, then your pupils dilate and they don't respond to light. So one of the tests that EMTs or paramedics do is shining a light into both eyes to see if the pupils are constricted or dilated, and if they're dilated, whether or not they respond to that light. If a person is still alive, the pupils should constrict at least a little bit, even with drugs that sometimes prevent it. And if there's no response at all, it's called a fixed and dilated pupil.
And why was that significant to you in your conclusion that Mr. Ellis died from hypoxia due to physical restraint?
Because at the same time that his pupils were fixed and dilated, and coupled with the fact that he was not breathing, it's my opinion that Mr. Ellis was already brain dead when the paramedics first examined him.
And what's the significance of that, to your opinion, that it's hypoxia that killed Mr. Ellis?
Well, it's something at that point had killed him because his brain was already dead. However, if it were a primary heart dysrhythmia, or if it were a methamphetamine overdose, I would expect the heart to be in a fast rhythm or in ventricular fibrillation. Ventricular tachycardia is a very fast rhythm that's still a normal rhythm, but way too fast. Sometimes it's so fast that the heart can't even fill, so that you don't get effective blood flow. Ventricular fibrillation is a step past that. With a normal heartbeat, the heart, as I think you learned in your high school anatomy course, your biology course, has 4 chambers. The heartbeat starts in one of the upper chambers called a depolarization. That's when a pacemaker discharges, causing an electrical signal that travels down eventually into the ventricles. It goes around the ventricles, and then at the same time the ventricular cells contract. The heart squeezes the blood that's in it, the blood goes out to the rest of the body, and then the heart muscle relaxes, the cells repolarize, they change their electrical conductivity back to the way it was before the heartbeat, and they wait for the next one. However, if something happens within the heart muscle to disrupt that normal flow, it can cause many different kinds of arrhythmias. The worst one is ventricular fibrillation, and that's when the heart muscle, instead of contracting all at once in a coordinated effort, the heart cells fire at different times. 2 or 3 here, followed by 2 or 3 here, followed by 2 or 3 here. So the heart doesn't have a coordinated contraction. It never fully depolarizes and it never fully repolarizes. It just wiggles and doesn't pump any blood. Once the heart is in that state, it can't go back.
And what do you mean by that, it can't go back?
The only way to get somebody out of ventricular fibrillation is with a defibrillator. That's an electrical device that is applied to the outside of the chest, an electrical shock is applied to stop the heart, to stop it completely. And when the heart starts up again, with any luck, it's going to be in a normal rhythm. Sometimes it isn't, but that's why defibrillation saves lives. That's why there are defibrillators in public spaces, because you have to do it quickly. And it's the only way to get somebody out of ventricular fibrillation. So the fact that he was not in ventricular fibrillation, and that's recorded on the rhythm strip that was done by the EMTs, suggests to me that it wasn't methamphetamine and that it wasn't the cardiomyopathy. And I was confident enough at that time to use that information to say, then it must be the other thing. It's the physical restraint that led to hypoxia.
Now, you said that there were three things. I started by asking about the significance of fixed and dilated pupils, but you said there was apneic. Is that right?
Apneic, meaning that he wasn't breathing. So the two things, the apnea, not breathing, not responding, his coma score was 3, which is the lowest you can get. He wasn't moving, he wasn't talking, he had no eye movement, he wasn't breathing. That's actually the same set of things we look at to determine whether somebody's brain dead in the hospital. And I'm confident saying that I believe he was brain dead at the time those measurements were made. So whatever killed him had already killed him. But at that point, his heart was still beating. That is also not unusual. The breathing depends on the brainstem, mostly. You don't have to think about breathing. It's controlled by your brain in a subconscious place. You can control it. You can override it if you want to, but you don't have to. You'll just breathe. If you become unconscious, you just breathe. That's not true, though, after the brainstem is dead. You stop breathing. There is no more respiratory drive. The heart, however, can continue to beat. And this is also not unusual in the cases of organ donation. In fact, that's why we have a different definition of brain death in Washington and most states than we used to, because people in the hospital can be clinically dead, they can be brain dead, but their heart can still be kept beating so that they can become organ donors. This is a similar situation. His brain was dead, or if not completely dead, he had irreversible brain damage that would inevitably lead to full brain death. Yet at the same time, his heart was still beating, and it was a rhythm that should have sustained life. There's some question about exactly what the initial rhythm was, and I still am not clear on that. Paramedic Wilson stated that there was a sinus rhythm, meaning that the heart was beating because of the normal atrial electrical impulse that starts every heartbeat. But the first rhythm strip that I saw was not a sinus rhythm. It was atrial fibrillation, meaning that the atria were fibrillating, but the ventricle wasn't. The ventricle was still pumping and should have been able to sustain life. I don't know why there's a discrepancy. My initial assumption was that I wasn't seeing the first rhythm strip that the machine knew about. And I asked that question, and we tried to get the full download from that life pack, and were unable to do it at the time, although I understand that it's been done and that the cardiologist who's testified had access to it. And it was his opinion, I read it in his transcript, that there never was any sinus rhythm. And he was able to see from the very first thing the machine printed. So I don't know where the sinus rhythm came from. It may have been an error. However, it doesn't really make any difference. The important thing is not whether it's PEA or whether it's a sinus rhythm that further deteriorated later. The important thing is at the time the EMTs first evaluated him, there was a rhythm that should have sustained life. He, at that point, had not been in ventricular fibrillation. And it's not 100%. Nothing in forensic pathology is 100%. But at that point, I was confident that methamphetamine didn't cause the death and that his enlarged heart didn't cause the death. So I'm left with the third factor, hypoxia. And, of course, that had multiple components as well. It had restraint with handcuffs, being face down, and having his hands and ankles tied in such a way that could make breathing difficult. It also involved a spit hood that was coated with secretions that would have made it difficult to breathe through it. But I don't have any way of fingering any one of those contributions, and I later discovered that there was another contribution that I didn't even know about at this time. But there isn't any way to pick one of them, or even to assign relative value to any one of them, because there is not enough known about how each one of them happened, and there aren't any studies that look at this particular set of circumstances that could lead us toward concluding that one of those mechanisms might be more important than another. It just doesn't exist. So the only thing I can say, it's due to the constellation of forces that I described in the category of restraint.
So in your report, you said that it was hypoxia due to physical restraint. And if you look at Exhibit 250, in your analysis, you also made a statement in there that it was, furthermore, an argument could be made that the extremely high methamphetamine concentration should be considered the primary factor. Can you explain to the jury why you made that statement?
I was reasonably confident. I think I'm going to need to go into the standards that I have to go by at this point to make sure the jury understands that the standard for medical examiners and for death certificates is 51%, more likely than not. And I was more confident than not that my conclusion was correct and that my death certificate was accurately certified. However, at that point, I wasn't fully confident because I had some conflicting information. For example, one or more of the reports described that Ellis was still talking at the time the paramedics arrived. I actually don't think that's possible, but if it really had happened, that would have to change my opinion. And I had to think, does that reduce the confidence? Can I still say this? I did still say it, and I think I said it correctly. I think I got it right, but I had to leave room for somebody who might want to disagree with me at that point.
Why did you conclude that methamphetamine hadn't caused Mr. Ellis's death?
Well, because methamphetamine should cause ventricular fibrillation. Does it 100% of the time? We can't answer that question.
Was there any evidence that Mr. Ellis had ventricular fibrillation
No.
when he was initially contacted?
No, there's evidence that he didn't. He couldn't have,
And why is that?
because you can't go back to a normal rhythm. You can't go back to atrial fibrillation once you have ventricular fibrillation.
And you talked about his heart issues. What would you expect to see in terms of his heart if it was his underlying heart issues that had caused his death?
Well, the enlarged heart is the underlying process that is most often responsible for the phenomenon known as sudden death. People walking along the street, I think I'm going to die. They fall over and they're dead. And that is usually because the heart goes into a sudden dysrhythmia, usually ventricular fibrillation. It's not always the case, but that's a common scenario. And that is what I would have expected. That didn't happen, but the heart is also not terribly enlarged. The heart is above a normal range, but not in a range in which I would say the heart is most likely to be the cause of death. Hearts are usually, when death is solely ascribed to a heart dysrhythmia that's due to the heart being enlarged, they're usually more in the range of 600 to 700 grams.
And so it sounds like you concluded initially, or you concluded in your initial autopsy report in May of 2020 that Mr. Ellis didn't die from methamphetamine, didn't die from underlying heart issues, and that he died from hypoxia as a result of physical restraint. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now you said that you issued a supplemental report. Can you just explain to the jury how that came about?
Well, the Ellis autopsy was one of the last ones that I did in my career, and I retired at the end of that year, but I didn't do any more cases. Well, I don't know if it was the last one, but it was close to the last one, and I spent the last few months finishing the cases that I still had that weren't finished yet. I had a bunch of them because at that point I also had to finish all the cases from the other pathologist who wasn't still in the office. So I had a lot of cases that I had to complete before I could actually walk out the door. After I signed this, I didn't hear about it for a while. But then, within a few weeks of the time I was supposed to retire, I got a call from the State Patrol who wanted to interview me about this case, which I did over the phone. And that actually was one of the last things, the very last things that I did in the office. And then on January 1st, I was gone. Well, then I heard from the Attorney General's office.
And who from the Attorney General's office contacted you?
John Hillman, I believe he is the chief of the criminal division. And he wanted me to become a consultant to the Attorney General's office for this case. And I thought about it, and I turned him down because I thought it was more appropriate for him to go back to the new medical examiner. Once I walk out the door, the new medical examiner inherits the responsibility for all of the old cases. And I thought that was the way it should be handled. You'd have to ask Mr. Hillman why he didn't do it, but he called me again later and again wanted me to do it, and I believe I turned him down that time as well. And it wasn't until a little bit later that I finally agreed to help, but with the understanding that I still had to be neutral because it was a case that I did when I was the medical examiner. I couldn't become his consultant, so to speak. I could become a consultant, but with still the goal of telling the truth.
And did you receive additional information from the from the Attorney General's office with respect to the underlying facts that you were asked to look at?
I did. I'm not sure that I can give you exact dates without access to my information system, but once I became a contractor and a consultant for the Attorney General's office, I had access to additional information that I did not have earlier. I had access to all of the existing law enforcement reports. I had access to well, at that point, I didn't have access to other experts. I did at a later time. But I began to get additional information that I didn't have in the first place.
And what were you asked with respect to that additional information?
What was I asked?
Yeah, by the Attorney General's office. What were you asked to do with that additional information?
Well, the Attorney General's office wanted me to consider additional information and state whether or not it would change my initial opinion.
And is that what you did?
That is what I did.
And what of the information that you received, what information, you mentioned that you got additional information that you didn't have before, correct?
That's correct.
Is it unusual for you, as a forensic pathologist, to consider other information that may come in at some later point?
Oh, no, that's quite normal.
And tell us why that is.
Because things change. Even when you think things aren't going to change, they still change. A report that was considered reliable may be proven unreliable. A fact that was considered to be a fact may turn out to be wrong. So you can't ever really say the case is finished, I'm not going to ever take another look at it. And people did question them. We had an office policy that I instituted that said that family members could question the cause of death or could question other things in the autopsy. All they had to do was write a letter saying what they thought was wrong and presenting any new evidence that they wanted us to consider. And we did it. Not many of them changed, but some of them did. So it's a standard practice.
And the additional information that you received from the Attorney General's office, did it change conclusion that Mr. Ellis died from hypoxia due to physical restraint?
No, but I need to interject that I paused just a minute ago when you asked the question about received from the Attorney General's office, because the most important new information that I got wasn't something that I received per se. I asked if I could be part of an interview with the firefighters who were the responders at the scene.
And why did you want to do that, Dr. Clark?
Because I had unresolved questions that I really wanted an answer to. One of them I've already mentioned. Was he really talking at the time that I think he was dead? And another one was, did he really have a strong heartbeat at a time when his heart was failing and was almost ready to quit? And those were things that I had not been able to nail down and really wanted to. So I had that opportunity and was able to ask all of the questions I wanted, and I was able to satisfy myself that he wasn't talking and that there was no significant heartbeat at the time the EMTs first saw him. If there was anything at all, it was called a weak and thready pulse, which in and of itself doesn't even mean he wasn't in PEA. He still could have been in PEA at that point. PEA doesn't necessarily mean you feel nothing. It means that the heart isn't able to produce its normal pulse of blood that would keep the body alive.
And is it, in your experience as a forensic pathologist, would you, in your history, gather information from the first responders to assist you in reaching your opinions as to cause of death?
That's not unusual. It happens probably on a daily basis, but mostly by the investigators in the office. It was a little bit unusual for me personally to do it, but by that point I wasn't working in the office anymore. I was retired, so I didn't have any investigators. So I wanted to do it myself anyway, because by that point it was becoming clear that this case was
I'll ask another question.
Okay.
So you wanted to personally ask some questions to try to nail down some facts that were important to your opinion?
right. I wanted to be confident. I wanted to be as confident as possible of my work, knowing that there could be consequences of my work. I mean, that's always the case, and I always want to be as confident as possible, but this was an opportunity to become more confident on this case where I still had some questions even after the first report was issued.
And you said that you had an opportunity to interview the first responders, the firefighters, and that was information that you received. Was there other information that you received that was important in terms of analyzing your opinions and the confidence that you had in your opinions?
Well, with regard to Exhibit 569, which is the timeline, nowhere on it does it say that there was one or more officers sitting on the chest or the back of the decedent, and that was information that came to me later. Well, that didn't change anything. He still, even without that, he had reasons to be hypoxic, but that bolsters the theory of hypoxia.
How so?
Because having somebody sit on you is worse than having your hands tied to your ankles. It's, in order to breathe, two things happen. You have a diaphragm, which is under the lungs, which you can't see really, and it moves, but it isn't the main thing that causes your lung to expand. Your rib cage expands. You have to be able to move your rib cage in order to expand your lungs and pull air in. And if something is constricting, again, if I could indicate on myself, if something is constricting your thorax, it's harder to move your chest. So that factor is an additional one that goes in the column of things that could have caused hypoxia.
And so you said that you authored a supplemental report. After you talked to EMS, you read the additional materials, you learned about the weight on Mr. Ellis's back. Tell us how, if at all, did your conclusion in the first autopsy report that Mr. Ellis died from hypoxia due to physical restraint change, if at all?
It became stronger
How so?
because I had more confidence in the fact that he didn't have a pulse, that he wasn't breathing, that he wasn't talking, and I had yet another force to put into the hypoxia group. So I was more confident, but it did not change the opinion. I did not need to change the death certificate.
And you referenced a minute ago Exhibit 569. Just explain to the jury what that document is.
Exhibit 569 is a double-sided copy of a timeline that was produced for me by the Sheriff's Department after I asked them to, several times actually.
Do you remember approximately when you got that document from law enforcement?
No.
Okay, if I show you a document and see if it refreshes your memory with respect to when you got it from law enforcement, hand you what's been marked as 269.
Did you say 60?
69, yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
269, I'm sorry. Handing you what's been marked as Exhibit 269. Can you tell the jury what that is?
Exhibit 269 is a copy of at least part of what's called the case notes in the medical examiner's information system as it existed at that time. I don't have any way of knowing if it's complete.
And looking at 269, can you see if there's, if that indicates, and I direct your attention to the page that ends with the page number 509, does that refresh your memory with respect to when you received that timeline from the Pierce County Sheriff's Office?
Yes, it does.
When did you receive that timeline from the Sheriff's Office?
I made a note on March 20th, 2020 at 1:25 p.m. that Detective Brockway brought the timeline.
And I think you said that the timeline, what information was not contained in the timeline that you didn't have?
The fact that one or more officers were sitting on him.
And did you get any other information at any point about changes to the timeline that you'd been provided?
Yes.
What did you receive?
I made a note about that. I'm pretty sure. Let me see if I can find it.
Direct your attention to the base number that ends 507.
Yes. On page 507 of Exhibit 269, there is a note from me on June 9th, 2020 at 11:20 a.m. Shall I read the note?
How about if you just summarize for us what you were told and how it might change the timeline?
The note says that I received a conference call from law enforcement, including Detective Brockway, Kevin Roberts, and from Keith Barnes, who's an investigator in the prosecutor's office. Detective Brockway was reviewing the case for presentation. This must have been right before we were supposed to present our findings to the prosecutor's office.
And when was that again? What was the date?
This was June 9th of 2020.
Okay, so that was more than almost a month after you had issued your report concluding that Mr. Ellis died from hypoxia due to physical restraint?
Yes.
All right, go ahead. What information did you receive that was different about the timeline?
Detective Brockway discovered a discrepancy in the time that the spit hood was placed. The original time, sorry, it's going to take me just a second to figure this out. The original time was at 11:24 p.m. and Detective Brockway gave me information that that time was incorrect and that the actual time was 11:27 p.m.
And did that information, that change in time about the length of time that the spit hood was on, did that change your opinion in any way? Or did it affect your opinion in any way?
No, it didn't, because the spit hood is one of several factors, and as I've already said, it's not possible to assign a weight to those factors. There are multiple factors that would have contributed to hypoxia. The spit hood is one of them. So if it's on a minute or two less, it doesn't make any real difference. There is a time issue. It takes about 3 minutes to become brain dead.
What's the significance of that?
Well, at the time he was first evaluated, and I think that time is known, although I'm not sure that time is confirmed as being accurate either, but when the first examination was made and the first recordings made of his heart rhythm, I'm confident that he was brain dead at that time. That means that he had to be in a hypoxic state for at least 3 minutes prior to that. Could be more, probably is more, but all it takes is 3 minutes of deprivation of oxygen and the brain dies. The brain has to have a constant source of oxygen, and it doesn't recover once brain death has set in. It doesn't reverse.
Now, you talked about the different types of restraint that you believe contributed to the hypoxia. Based on the timeline, did you also have any information that weighed into your opinion with respect to anything that Mr. Ellis might have said or done at the scene that contributed to your opinion that he died from hypoxia?
He said he couldn't breathe.
Was that information that was provided to you?
Yes, I had that information already. I'm not sure that I have I think the time and the number of occurrences changed, but he did say, I can't breathe, and I knew about that.
At the time that you determined that he died from hypoxia?
Yes.
We're close to the morning break. It's a good time to break. I was going to go on.
It's a good time to break. It is our morning break time, so we'll take a recess, ladies and gentlemen, 15 minutes. Please do not discuss case among yourselves with anyone else, and we'll resume in about 15 minutes. Thank you.
your report. You indicated that I didn't give you the complete report. It was missing your toxicology report as well as your body diagram. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, we're going to hand you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 2583. And you can keep that one as well. Is that exhibit the complete report, including the toxicology report, and have your body diagram on it?
Defense exhibit, right?
Sorry,
Thanks.
Exhibit 2583.
Sure.
It is.
Okay, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Pritchard?
Thank you. Doctor, good morning. Doctor, starting actually, let's start with Exhibit 2583. And that consists of a couple of different portions to that, correct?
Yes.
And the first is, I think, the 4 or 5 page report, which is your initial autopsy evaluation.
Yes.
And then there's the autopsy report, which was actually done through the state toxicology lab.
Yes, the toxicology report is present, and it was done by NMS, National Medical Services.
Right, they referred it to NMS.
That's right.
For purposes of evaluation. And the tox report came back at 2,400 nanograms per milliliter of blood for the methamphetamine concentration. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then it showed the amphetamine at 54 nanograms per milliliter. That's the metabolite.
In this case, yes, the amphetamine would be considered a metabolite.
Okay. And then on the last page of your report is actually the last 2 pages are the physical diagram that was prepared at the autopsy as well. And I understand this is for prison review.
That's right.
And you talked about earlier about anatomical findings for the cause of death, and you stated there was no anatomical findings that caused Mr. Ellis's death, correct?
That's right.
But he had markings on his body, he had bruises and abrasions, there was taser marks.
He did have evidence of injury.
Okay, so, and you were aware that he was in a struggle with law enforcement the day before?
I was aware of that.
Okay. And that was the attempts of the law enforcement officers to place him under arrest?
Lack foundation.
Well, he had some understanding of what this was when he made the report based upon the ultimate conclusion that he reached. So I'll allow him to answer the question overall.
That is my understanding.
Okay. And also you had, I think as part of your materials, you had Mr. Etzett's report. Do you have that?
I'm looking. I do not.
Let me see if I can find that. And Mr. Edsett was one of the medical investigators.
That's correct.
Sir, on the hand you was marked as Exhibit 265. Take a look at this and see if you recognize that document.
I do.
And that's Mr. Edsett's report.
This is part of it.
And what part of it is, just so we make sure.
This is a printout from the information system showing the contents of the database fields that exist on this case. Mr. Adsett would have done some of it, but other people probably did some of it as well. In addition to this, Jacob Adsett should have written a narrative summary that's not part of the information system, but is also not included in this Exhibit 265.
I'm getting things out of order here. Let me see if I can. Let me show you what's marked as Exhibit 264. See if you recognize this document.
Yes. Exhibit 264 is a copy of the circumstances of death, the narrative report that was written by Jacob Atzett.
And this is done before you actually see the body, correct?
He makes his observations before I see the body. He probably wrote this report sometime after. I don't know when he wrote the report.
Okay, but that is part of the compilation of information that's provided from the medical examiner's office to law enforcement, to other individuals that requested.
Yes.
And within that, Mr. Etzett talks about the scuffle between the officers.
Yes, he does.
That there was restraint reviews, which you're aware of.
Yes.
That he was tased a couple of times.
Yes.
He was placed in the hobbles.
Yes.
It also talks about his medical history, and there's both intravenous drug use and other types of drug use.
Yes, it does.
Okay. And it also talks about Mr. Ellis's health history in that document as well, does it not?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And that's just part of the information that the medical examiner's office receives, and then in addition, you prepare your autopsy report, which includes the toxicology report, correct?
Yes.
And there's some other miscellaneous documents that include that entire file, correct?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, you referred to a couple of exhibits that Ms. Eek showed you regarding timelines of other materials that you reviewed in the process of this case, correct?
Yes.
And that is also part of your toxicology file?
Well,
I'm sorry, not toxicology, your medical examiner's file.
the medical examiner's office doesn't have, or at least we didn't at that time, a single thing that we could call a case file. We had the database, the results of which are in Exhibit 265.
Correct.
264 would have been a Word document. And in addition to that, we had some paper storage and some electronic storage of documents.
Okay. And just getting back to exhibits 2583. And again, that is your initial autopsy report, correct?
Yes,
And you talked about the three different areas that you were looking at for purposes of the cause of death of Mr. Ellis, correct?
that's right.
And it was hypoxia due to physical restraint, and then dilated cardiomyopathy.
Yes,
And then you prepared a supplemental report dated May 24th, 2021. That was prepared and sent to John Hillman, one of the attorneys at the Attorney General's office.
that's correct.
And you went through, in the analysis on the first page, you talked about that your autopsy report identified three factors that may have contributed to the death. And then you listed hypoxia due to physical restraint, methamphetamine intoxication, and a dilated heart. Correct?
That's correct.
And then you stated as well, that is still the case following additional consideration.
That's correct.
So you're not changing your autopsy report.
No.
And then you stated that you received some additional information about during the fight between Mr. Ellis and the officers, that he was placed into first hand restraints or handcuffed, correct?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Right, and then he was hobbled, correct?
He was at some point hobbled, but I'm not sure that I can answer your question if it implies the order in which things happened, because
That's fine, let's don't worry about the order, I just want to ask you the different parts to it.
Yes.
He was hobbled,
yes, he was hobbled.
and there apparently, at some point in time, there was weight applied to him on the backside.
Yes,
And there also was a spit mask that was applied.
yes,
And those, so we have the meth intoxication, the dilated heart, and then the restraint, the hobbling, the weight, and the spit mask as part of the circumstances that attributed to Mr. Ellis's death, correct?
that's correct.
Is there anything else that you considered for purposes of causing his death in this manner?
I was aware that a taser was applied to him, but I don't think the taser contributed significantly. If you survive, I mean, the taser is capable of causing ventricular fibrillation under the right circumstances. But if it doesn't, it can't come back and bite you later.
Okay.
I was,
No evidence that it did in this particular case.
well, it did not cause ventricular fibrillation,
Okay.
and I don't think it could have caused a delayed death. I don't think tasers do that.
Fine. And you didn't find that in your report?
No. Well, I mentioned it, but I didn't discuss it.
Very good.
I also know placed on a neck restraint, but again, like the taser, if you survive it, meaning you didn't get a neck injury and you didn't die from asphyxia while you were in it, you recover.
Sure.
And it shouldn't have any long-term effects.
Fair enough. And in fact, during your autopsy examination of the body, you checked his neck. There was no broken hyoid bone or any other type of issues in the neck area, correct?
His neck is actually checked several ways.
Okay.
The neck organs are removed and examined. That includes the larynx, the voice box, the thyroid gland, and the hyoid bone, which is a small horseshoe-shaped bone that sits above the larynx. It serves as the point of attachment for muscles that run up and down the neck. It is also frequently injured in the case of manual strangulation, although it should not be injured in the case of a lateral vascular neck restraint. The neck is also examined from the top. After the brain is removed, the base of the skull is visible, and that includes the foramen magnum, which is the hole in the bottom of the skull through which the spinal cord and blood vessels come up from the back of the neck into the skull. If the neck vessels are damaged, the blood vessels, then you can see that blood by looking at the top of the spinal column, and there was not any blood there. Finally, before the body leaves, the neck is checked for fractures by hand, and the fractures were not present in the neck.
And also you indicated that there's no hemorrhage of the strap muscles in the neck, correct?
That's right. Those are muscles that run in the front of the neck, as I'm indicating on myself, and they sometimes become damaged during the course of manual strangulation, which means strangling somebody with the fingers, as I'm indicating on myself. The point pressure where the fingers impact those neck muscles can lead to hemorrhage, bruising, and actual bleeding, and that is sometimes visible in a case of manual strangulation. It wasn't there, but again, it should not be there in a case of lateral vascular neck restraint.
And in fact, you didn't find any damage to the neck?
I found no damage to the neck.
And then you, like I said, you in your supplemental report, you talked about I'm not sure it's new information, but additional information that you gleaned over the following year before preparing this particular report.
Yes.
And still your conclusion is the same.
My conclusion did not change.
And in fact, you referenced the spit hood as being, quote, possibly the most important factor contributing to hypoxia. Correct?
That was in the original, and I think I quoted it in the supplement. That is not a strong endorsement. That's kind of a weak endorsement of the spit hood. I was a little bit, I was surprised by the amount of stuff, secretions, blood on the inside of that, spit hood, and I think that has the potential to be obstructive. If that sticky substance gets across the face, that could completely cut off breathing. And that's why I said could be the most important, because it could totally cut off breathing. The other things are not likely to totally cut off breathing, but if I'm put in a position of having to choose which of those various components is the most important in terms of coming to a conclusion about the cause of death, I would have a hard time doing that. I can't really point to one of them as being the incriminating event.
And that's fair, but I just want, in your supplemental autopsy report, you stated the following: the spit hood is identified in the autopsy report as possibly the most important factor contributing to hypoxia, and that is still correct.
Yeah.
That's what you wrote.
Yes, that's what I wrote.
All right, so the spit hood was of the categories that might be the most significant part leading to the hypoxia.
Yes, in that it had the potential, because of all of the secretions on it, to occlude the airway.
Very good. Now, doctor, also, you have Exhibit 24, if we could publish that, please. You have Exhibit 24 is in front of you, which is the timeline. There you go. Great, thanks, and we could blow that up with a little bigger. There. Okay, doctor, this is the report that you received from the lieutenant from Engine 10. I think it's Mr. Wilson, is that correct?
I believe that's correct.
And you talked about that when paramedics arrived, that your understanding is that Mr. Ellis was, let's find the words here, he was apneic, and then he had developed, on the second line of the second paragraph, it says he was apneic when they arrived and he rapidly developed cardiac arrest. Correct?
I'm looking for that wording.
Apneic with bradycardia, which despite aggressive EVM airway management rapidly developed into cardiac arrest.
It's the second paragraph.
Second paragraph on the first page.
Oh, yes, I see it.
Okay. And that's the information that you looked at or considered, correct?
I did look at and consider that information, yes.
And you also said that you wanted to be part of the firefighter interviews to ask specific questions of Lieutenant Wilson.
Well, not just Lieutenant Wilson, but all of the
I
paramedics.
understand that, but I'm dealing with Lieutenant Wilson. So you wanted to be part of that interview.
Yes.
And you actually inserted yourself and started asking Lieutenant Wilson questions.
I didn't insert myself. I was invited to be there by the Attorney General.
All right, you asked questions at the interview.
I did.
And you asked questions of Lieutenant Wilson about what it is that he found at that, when he first arrived at the scene, correct?
Yes.
It sounds like you asked him if Mr. Ellis was speaking, is that correct?
I asked all of them. We did several interviews.
Now, we're going to focus on Lieutenant
Okay,
Wilson. You
yes.
asked Lieutenant Wilson if he was speaking.
Yes.
And it sounds as if Lieutenant Wilson said no, he was not speaking.
Wilson, to the best of my recollection, did say he was not speaking.
Okay. And then you indicated that he was in PEA, which the jury has heard previously.
Yes.
Pulseless electrical activity. Meaning that you can see a pulse, but you can't feel it, correct?
You can see electrical waveforms, but it doesn't generate a pulse that you can feel.
Now, you had the chance to not only speak with Lieutenant Wilson, but it sounds like you've seen his transcript from the trial here, correct?
I have seen his transcript.
And he testified to the jury that when he first arrived by Mr. Ellis, that he had a weak and thready pulse, but he could feel it, correct?
That is what he said.
And he said that his respiration was poor, and they put the bag mask valve on him, correct?
I can't remember if that's what he said in the transcript. That sounds right.
All right. And so the bag mask is where they're physically putting air into his lungs, correct?
Yes.
But he still has a pulse, and Lieutenant Wilson said he's checking it regularly as he's attending to other concerns that he has of Mr. Ellis, correct?
I'm sorry, I can't remember the details. I didn't have time to spend a lot of time on the transcript. I just checked it to see if there was anything that conflicted with my findings.
All right, and that's fine. And then if we go to the second page, please. Right, actually go back one. Let's see. Go to page 3, please. sorry, can I take a look at your exhibit there? Page 2 of Exhibit 24. That's good, okay, very good. All right. Now, doctor, on page 2, under where it says procedures, you see that?
Yes.
All right. It says that the bag valve mask started at 23:36:53, correct?
Yes.
And then the electrocardiographic monitoring was started shortly thereafter, correct?
Yes.
Right. And then it says cardiac CPR was started at 23:41, correct?
Yes.
So about 4.5 minutes after they started the bag valve mask, then paramedics started CPR, correct?
Yes.
And so if Lieutenant Wilson stated that they had a pulse for the first 4.5 minutes before they started CPR, that would establish that he was not in PEA at the time that the paramedics arrived, correct?
If he had a pulse with effective blood delivery, he wouldn't have been in PEA, but a weak pulse, a thready pulse, doesn't necessarily mean that he's not in PEA.
Lieutenant Wilson has been a paramedic for 20 plus years at this point. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
And his role in this particular case, like in other cases for the past 20 years, is to attend to those folks' emergency needs upon arriving at the scene, correct?
Yes.
And so, if he's saying that he felt a pulse, and there was no need to perform CPR at that point in time, can we accept his word that indeed there was a pulse that he thought was sufficient for purposes of pulsating blood through the body?
Your Honor, objection. Calls for comment on this credibility and argumentative.
Well, that would make it, the answer to that would make a difference in your opinion, wouldn't it?
The way I'm planning to answer it, no.
But it could. So I'll let you answer the question. Overruled.
I have no doubt that paramedic Wilson thought he was doing the right thing.
Okay?
I'm not sure that he was doing the right thing because I'm not sure whether he actually felt a pulse or not.
All right, fair enough, but that's what he testified to. You could agree or disagree what his...
Yeah, he was probably, I'm sure he was trying to do the right thing, and he probably thought he was doing the right thing.
Now, if we could go to Exhibit 898, please. Now, Doctor, I don't know that you've seen this exhibit before. Let me know if you have.
I don't think I've seen this exhibit.
Okay, and I'll represent to you that this is the times in which various law enforcement officers arrived at the scene of Mr. Ellis per the cabinet. Okay?
Okay.
And it starts with officers Rankin and Ford that appeared at 23:24:19. And before that point in time, we have Mr. Ellis, Officer Burbank, and Officer Collins are in their altercation. Will you accept that?
Yes,
Does that make sense based on the material you've reviewed as well?
it does.
And so there is Sergeant Lim arrives at 23:24:44. And then we see the balance of the police officers arriving over time. Correct?
Yes,
You indicated that you learned that the spit mask was applied at closer to 23:27 hours, correct?
yes.
Now, when in this exhibit 898, can you say that Mr. Ellis was hypoxic at any point in time during this particular exhibit?
That's a complicated answer, but you asked for it, so here it comes.
Okay?
The times that EMS recorded are not necessarily accurate. That was one of my concerns
Okay.
when we went into the meeting with the EMS that I crashed. And the problem is the times aren't necessarily entered in real time. One of the EMTs has an iPad that they use to enter, but they don't have it in their hands the whole time. They told me that when they got there, somebody put it on the ground, somebody else picked it up and started entering times, but the manual times are merged into the times that are recorded automatically by the machine that records times, and there isn't any way to tell the difference whether it was a machine-generated time or a manually generated time. So the times could be off. I don't know whether they are or not. That's just a caveat that makes it more difficult to answer questions that depend on time down to the granularity of seconds.
That's fine. Let's assume that these are the times that are represented to be the cab, by the cab, where the officers arrived at the scene.
Yes, those are probably accurate. I'm not questioning those.
So my question is, again, was Mr. Ellis hypoxic between 23/24/19 and 23/27/21?
When the EMTs,
No, doctor, my question is very straightforward. Was Mr. Ellis hypoxic between 23/24/19 and 23/27/21?
I object that you should be permitted to answer the question that he was trying to do.
He's, I think the issue was he wasn't answering the question that the council posed, so I'll permit this to stand as asked now.
I will answer the question. I was going to go through my reasoning, but I'm going to have to do it quietly and do it anyway. So it's going to take me just a second. I think I'm ready to answer it, but now you're going to have to ask your question again.
Certainly, was Mr. Ellis hypoxic between 23/24/19 and 23/27/21?
I can't say that he wasn't, but I can't prove that he was.
Okay, so your answer is you don't know.
That would be another way of wording it.
Fair enough. Okay, and so are you aware that Mr. Ellis was combative still at 23/26/58?
He could be combative and still hypoxic. So when you say hypoxic, I don't know whether you mean hypoxic to the point that he's unconscious or hypoxic to the point that he's feeling air hunger but still able to talk and struggle. So it's not completely a clear question that I'm being asked to answer.
Okay, so you don't know. That's what I think you said.
I think we're going to have to go there again.
Okay, very good. Now, also, Doctor, you
Well,
were...
the question had to do with whether or not he knew whether Mr. Ellis was combative at 23/26/28.
I'm sorry?
The question was, did he know whether or not Ellis was combative at that time?
They just...
And he simply answered that he could be combative and still be hypoxic, but that wasn't necessarily the question.
Let me re-ask the question. Doctor, do you know whether Mr. Ellis was combative at 23/26/58?
No, I know that he was combative during part of this timeline, but I don't know exactly where on the timeline he was combative.
Okay. Doctor, after you were... Doctor, you were interviewed back in December 30, 2020 by there was a report that was generated on December 30, 2020 regarding your Are you familiar with that interview?
You haven't said who the interview was
Well,
with.
it was with yourself, John Hillman, Mr. Liu, sitting behind me, a Shayla Stallings, Ollie Elenia, Pierce
Right.
County Prosecutor Drew Scott, and yourself, present for the Zoom interview. Are you familiar
Yes,
with that?
I remember it.
And you were asked questions regarding what, basically what your findings were, and you were questioned at length regarding the spit sock and its involvement. You recall
I
that?
do recall that.
And you were asked a question regarding basically your overall opinion. And you stated that should there be charges filed in this case, we would have a problem with his 51% standard. He doesn't think that we would be able to overcome the, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt standard.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. These aren't statements. This is a summary from somebody else's statement from Dr. Clark.
I would finish the question.
Well, you can ask if that's what he said.
I'm glad I'm doing it.
Yeah.
Would you like to start over?
Yes.
This is attributed to you. I want to make sure that this is correct. This is from a memorandum. It says, Dr. Clark stated that should there be charges filed in this case, then we would have a problem with this 51% standard. He doesn't think that we would be able to overcome the, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt post-quote standard with his testimony. If legal standard would require him to say that Ellis would not have died without the restraint of the spit sock. Dr. Clark doesn't see how we can prove that. Do you recall making that statement?
I recall the meeting, and I recall making a similar statement. I doubt if I would have specifically referenced charges because that isn't my business. What I probably said was that the standard that I go by is 51%. The standard you go by is higher than that. As hard as it is to believe, there are attorneys who don't know that in advance, that the standard that medical examiners use is lower than the standard. And so I have to make that clear. This isn't the only time I've said it. I've said it in every meeting I've been in with any attorney on a criminal case. I think the wording that's attributed to me is probably summarized and changed slightly. The idea is correct in that I wanted them to understand that I wouldn't be able to testify to the same standard and that they would have to get that information from somewhere else other than me if they were going to prove their case.
Okay. Because you just don't know, frankly, how Mr. Ellis died, given the constellation of issues that he surrounded himself with.
Well, that depends upon the granularity that you ask. I think he died as a result of asphyxia, but if you get into which asphyxia mechanism, that becomes much harder, and I think the best way that I can word that is that he died as a result of some combination of those events.
And the combination of events being, in addition to methamphetamine intoxication and the enlarged heart.
Well, no, when I say the constellation of events, I mean the ones that specifically were included in the group of those events that could cause hypoxia. That would be restraint, the spit hood, the body weight on him.
But you can't attribute a particular percentage to any of those.
No, I can't.
But you did state that the spit would be the most significant of those.
Well, I said it could be.
Well, you didn't say that the weight could be.
Sorry?
You didn't say that the weight on his back could have been.
I didn't know about it.
Well, you didn't say that the restraint itself could have been.
The restraint itself is a difficult thing to evaluate. There are papers. I have made the statement to the jury that there are no papers that help, and that's true. There are papers, though, that address the question of whether restraint can cause hypoxia, and there's about an equal number on each side of the fence. Some yes, some no. And so those papers don't help. It's not possible to say even how long he was restrained in what position. We don't know the seconds. We don't know exactly what position. So I cannot assign a weight to each one of those factors. I just have to say that it was some combination of those factors.
And so with respect to the weight, or how long, or if Mr. Ellis was placed in a recovered position, how long, all of those are factors that you simply do not know the answers to, correct?
I know that it happened,
Correct.
but I don't know for how long or exactly how, and that's the best I can do.
Fair enough. And doctor, with respect to the idea that Mr. Ellis was brain dead, if in fact what Lieutenant Wilson testified to, that he actually felt a pulse, and that's why they didn't start CPR when they first arrived, Mr. Ellis was not brain dead.
No, he could have been brain dead. You can be brain dead and still have a pulse.
Okay. A palpable pulse.
Yes,
And still be breathing.
yes, you can have a heartbeat as long as you have artificial ventilation, either the bag mask.
That was my question. And still be breathing. You can still be breathing even if you're brain dead.
No.
All right, so when Lieutenant Wilson arrived, he felt a pulse. He felt that he had labored breathing, but he needed to assist that. So if he had labored breathing, he was not brain dead, correct?
I'm going to object to that in the state's Lieutenant Wilson's testimony.
Well, you can respond. Go ahead.
That's not my impression of what Mr. Wilson thought based on the meeting in which I got to ask him directly. He said breathing was agonal, meaning occasional inadequate respirations, not enough to support life. So I don't think that would count as breathing. His brain was if those agonal respirations were still happening when he first saw him, that means the brain maybe wasn't quite dead but was well on the way. But in the same, in Exhibit 24, Mr. Wilson describes apnea, and that is not breathing. That's what he said when he did his exam, chest apnea, not breathing.
But you'd had a chance to be as part of his interview.
Yes.
You were there, and you heard what he said there, correct?
Yeah, he said occasional, shallow, ineffective respirations.
Right, and that's why they had to put the bag mask on.
Yes.
Right, so he's still breathing.
He may be in the final stages of brain death at that point, but he's probably, undoubtedly at that point, he has irreversible brain injury. I think legally, if it were a hospital patient, you couldn't say he's brain dead unless he has no respiratory effort at all. But it's my impression from talking to Mr. Wilson that he very quickly went to no respiratory effort at all.
Well, he was on the bag valve mask about 3.5 minutes.
Right, but they can tell when they're bagging him whether or not he's going to make a respiratory effort.
And they still felt the heartbeat for about 3.5 minutes.
I have reservations about whether they felt a heartbeat, or even if they felt one, whether or not it was enough to support life. I don't know the answer to that. But whether they felt the heartbeat or not, this is a man with fixed and dilated pupils, either no respiratory effort or almost no respiratory effort, and no consciousness. Yet he had a heart rhythm, whether or not there was a beat, that should have sustained life.
Would it be fair to say that you just don't have enough information currently to make a determination one way or another as to whether Mr. Ellis was brain dead at the time that the EMS individuals arrived?
I think he was brain dead.
You think that, but there sounds like there could be a differing opinion.
Somebody else could differ, but I think he was brain dead.
Okay. With respect to a person who is hypoxic or is experiencing hypoxia, is that something that like a lay individual would necessarily notice?
A lay individual might not notice if somebody's hypoxic, not trying to speak, but still conscious. If a hypoxic person were trying to speak, it might be possible to notice that there was difficulty catching his breath, as it were. If the hypoxia were advanced, an observer might notice that he was breathing fast or trying very hard to get a deep breath. There's a wide variety of answers to that question.
If I went running and I ran, a distance and I'm breathing hard and I'm trying to catch my breath, would that necessarily mean I'm hypoxic?
No, it wouldn't.
Okay. And so that sounds like what I just described to you mimics hypoxia to some extent. Correct?
Yes.
All right. And so even law enforcement officers that are first trying to apprehend Mr. Ellis, and they're in a struggle where Mr. Ellis is fatigued, Officers Burbank and Collins are equally fatigued. They wouldn't necessarily know he was in any type of distress except that he's tired, correct?
Well, another way of answering that question would be, it isn't possible to know that somebody's hypoxic without measuring
Okay.
the oxygen in the blood, and that was not done at that point. They didn't have a pulse oximeter.
It wasn't measured at any point in time that evening. was it?
No, I don't believe that it was.
Yeah, excuse me, one second. Doc, I guess, with the scheduled situation, I asked you about the significance of it, but you recall that you and I had a chance to speak back in February 23rd, 2023?
I don't recall the date, but we have met.
Right. And it was a Zoom interview that was arranged by the defense, correct?
Yes.
And I asked you again, at that point in time, regarding the spit hood, and I asked you a question about, the report says that the spit hood could have been the most important factor, and I said, well, you're changing your report. He said, no, I'm not changing it. You say that, quote, I still think the spit hood is probably the most important factor in Mr. Ellis' death. Correct?
I don't remember if I said it that way or not.
Would you like to see the report?
Is it a transcript?
It is.
Yes, then I would like to see it.
Correct, correct. Which we do. Dr. Haney was marked as exhibit 418. Take a look at this. Please, I'll give you the page one second. Doctor, if you could take a look at page 23. You start at line 18, you go to 24, line 3. Review that yourself.
Well, I've reviewed it.
And again, you referenced that the spit hood is probably the most important factor in the various factors that you referenced, correct?
My answer on line 4 is I expressed that as a conditional. I said may or possibly because I can't prove that it was.
I'm talking about the bottom of page 23 to the top of page 24. Line 3, page 24.
And what is my question?
I asked you about whether you were changing your opinion regarding the significance of the spit mask, and you said no, you weren't. You said it was probably, I still think the spit mask or spit hood is probably the most important.
Right, probably. It's still conditional.
Okay, but that's the most important factor of the conditional factors.
Well, probably the most important, but still one of several factors. I can't separate the spit hood out as the cause of death.
Okay, very good. Judge, it's time for a break.
Sure. We're about a minute short, but we'll take our break at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our noon recess. Please be back by 1:15. Please do not discuss case among yourselves or with anyone else. Thank you.